don't mean to suggest that he is a man who is without controversy. He speaks his mind, but the greatness of the American military service, and particularly the greatness of the Navy, is symbolized in this ceremony today. Because this man who is controversial, this man who comes up with unorthodox ideas, did not become submerged by the bureaucracy. Because once genius is submerged, a nation is doomed to mediocrity. Richard Nixon, in a ceremony awarding Rickover his rank as 4-star admiral. Hyman G. Rickover was a 4-star admiral in the U.S. Navy. He's known as the father of the nuclear navy. Rickover would become the longest-serving active-duty military officer in U.S. history, with 63 years of service. He left a lifetime legacy of achievements, overseeing the development of atomic energy to not only power naval ships, but also land-based power plants. His high standards for excellence and accountability were felt far beyond the U.S. Navy, yet few other military officers in history have been so controversial. Hyman Rickover was born to a Jewish family on January 27, 1900, in Moscow, Russian Poland. His family immigrated to the United States in 1906 to escape the anti-Semitism of Russia. Rickover knew his family could not pay to send him to college, but fortunately, through connections, he was able to have the opportunity to attend the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, tuition-free. Life was not easy for a Jewish midshipman at the Naval Academy, but Rickover's bad temper and stubbornness also contributed to his troubles. Rickover didn't participate at any of the Academy's athletics. He much more preferred to study in his free time. Rickover's early naval career through World War II was not particularly that outstanding. His duties included time on battleships and later submarines. In 1946, he was selected to go to Oak Ridge National Laboratory to develop a nuclear electric generating plant. He would spend the next 40 years of his career devoted to the development and perfection of nuclear power.
When he was sent to the Manhattan Project, that was early in the history of nuclear research, and he started looking into what was going on, and he immediately saw that the future of nuclear power was potentially very, very important. And he himself had been a submariner. He had been in submarines. So the idea of harnessing that and putting it into a submarine, everybody just looked at him and said, "You're nuts, you can't do that. You can't possibly put this dangerous reactor with all this nuclear stuff in it, and put that in a submarine that's going to go out, twist and turn and up and down and go all over the world." And he said, "Yes, we can."
Nuclear would allow almost unlimited operational range without having to consider any fueling limits. By now, though, the Navy had other priorities and did not see that atomic power for propulsion was realistic. He had to fight against major opposition from his Navy bureaucracy, but Rickover was determined. With the threat of having his department shut down, Rickover took a brash step and went straight to Admiral Chester Nimitz. Nimitz immediately saw Rickover's point and approved the project. Rickover then began the development of the first nuclear-powered submarine, the USS Nautilus. Because he recognized the extreme danger of working with atomic energy, Rickover knew he must create not only the submarine, but also develop operational procedures and train people to ensure nuclear-powered propulsion would be safe.
This is pretty standard on how people look at the nuclear propulsion program. The first influence he had was in its design. It's high technology in those days, and still is today. And he made sure the design was as simple and effective as possible. The next influence he had, beside design, was what we call procedures. That's the way in which you operate the propulsion plant. He made sure the procedures were dead accurate. Very accurate. And the third thing is people. He influenced the people. The people who ride U.S. submarines are hand-selected, and he made sure of that. And he also holds them to, they did in those days, hold them to a high accountability.
Rickover personally interviewed every officer to enter the nuclear program. His interviews were legendary.
So I went through my interview, and it was quite disturbing. Initially, he was famous for throwing people out the first time in just to make sure they really wanted to get in the program. He sat there and just read my file quietly for it seemed like interminable. I'm sure it was only a couple of minutes. And then he closed it, slammed it on his desk and said, "Well, what do you have to say for yourself, Hill?" And I said, I'd just like to thank you, Admiral. And he said, "I don't want to hear you. I don't want you to say anything other than what I asked you. Now, what do you have to say for yourself?" And I said, thought about it for a second. I said, "Well, first I'd like," he said, "Get out of here." So he threw me out, and then I got called back in, and he was quite busy again, telephone, this coming in, papers to sign, and he looked up and he said, "What are you doing back in here?" And I said, "Well, they told me to come back in that." So he said, "Well, you know, you're losing every year. You're dropping. You're not doing as well. You're going down and you're standing." I was going to say, "Admiral, the class gets smaller. Therefore, although I'm going up in numbers, as it gets smaller, my percentages drop down a little bit." But I made the mistake of opening that by saying, "Admiral, you don't understand." That was a terrible mistake because he exploded all over the place. And then he came back in again and he said, "All right, so I'm running out of time. So are you ready to get this done?" I said, "Yes, sir, I am ready. This is what I want you to do." He detailed very extensively what my study program was going to be for the rest of the year. And these are the grades you have to make. This is the standing you have to achieve. You have to get this number in your class. And you got to do all this. You got to study all these hours. So I went out. I had no idea how I'd done. And a couple of weeks later, they posted a list at the academy of who had been accepted. And I was on the list, so I was thrilled.
Rickover's standards and intense focus on personal integrity are largely credited with being responsible for the U.S. Navy's continuing record of zero reactor accidents. Long after Rickover's era of control, nuclear-trained officers still feel the effects of the standards that he put in place over 50 years ago.
I chose the submarine force because of its reputation for superior performance and exceptional personnel, which was a direct result of Hyman Rickover's effect. His thumbprint was still obvious from the very moment I selected the service because the interview process was still very intense. Even before I was even allowed into the service, I was interviewed by several engineers in Washington, D.C. before I was granted permission to join the submarine force.
I arrived on board USS Cheyenne as part of the pre-commissioning unit in 1996, and even though that was 10 years after Admiral Rickover had passed away, the programs he had put in place and the effect he had on the nuclear navy was still very present as we prepared that ship to take it to sea. Everything we did was oriented around the safe and effective operation of that nuclear power plant. Admiral Rickover's name was mentioned practically every day that I was on board that ship. The impact that Admiral Rickover had on the nuclear power program is unbelievable. Even 20 years after he has passed away, the program is still what it is because of what he had put in place.
Rickover continued high-level bargaining to get his way in Washington, which was not admired by his Navy superiors. He was passed over twice for advancement, which normally ends a Navy officer's career. However, his connections in Congress and the press persuaded the Navy Advancement Board to change their minds. On January 31, 1982, after 63 years of service to his country and 13 presidents from Woodrow Wilson to Ronald Reagan, Rickover was forced to retire from the Navy as a full admiral. Admiral Hyman George Rickover was a remarkable man. He almost single-handedly and against major opposition created for the United States a nuclear navy second to none. Without Rickover's contributions, nuclear propulsion would probably still be a science fiction fantasy.